Okay. Ibrahim, are you going to be kicking this one off?
Yep, I'll be kicking it off and then handing it off immediately.
Okay.
Natalie, are you ready?
I am.
Hi. Let's do a quick round of introduction and then we will get started here. So Bethany, nice to meet you. This is Ibrahim Kadam. I'm with Stantec. I think you probably have, we've met in one of the GSPAC meetings before.
Yes, yes.
Mali?
Yeah, this is Mali Karami Golbaghi with Stantec, and nice to meet you all.
And we have Eddie.
Hey guys, again, this is Eddie Teasdale, Ludo from Scamanini, working with Stantec to develop the GSP for you all. Thanks.
And we, our fearless leader, Christy.
I think everybody knows who I am, so everybody gets sick hearing from me. But
who else we have on the call, Christy?
Let's see, Scott, did you? We've got Scott Hornung and Brenna Sullivan, both from our GSPAC, and Marina and William from Water Resources, and that's all so far.
Okay. Cool.
And I've sent a message to Peter. He did not respond for if he was going to attend or not, but I know he got the information. So I just shot him a note really quick to let him know we're meeting.
Yeah. So thank you everyone for making the GDE meeting here for the committee. Groundwater dependent ecosystem, or GDEs, are extremely important topic throughout the state of California, and especially for the GSPs, Sigma, which being given its own specific mandate and requirements. So today, part of the call will go, Mali will walk us through the water code and Sigma regulations in terms of what Sigma should address regarding the GDEs, one. Then we will talk about a couple steps we've done to date, which is kind of try to identify the GDEs in the basin, and kind of we want to get your feedback. This is probably some of the material that has been published in the section 2 that you have reviewed a few weeks ago. So you should be pretty up to speed on it, but we want to go over it in detail and talk about some additional GDEs identified since the comments provided by the different GSPAC members. So we would like to get your feedback into whether you think the identification is done appropriately, there is any other items we should bring on the table. And then we will talk a little bit about what we think the health of the GDEs that we identified looks like based on the evidence we have. We have another meeting on GDEs, which is scheduled for September 2nd, which we will deal with at that meeting with mostly will focus on the hitch. Peter would provide an overview about the hitch in terms of its life cycle and history in the basin and so forth. And I think Sarah Ryan will also provide some perspective on it from the tribal perspective in terms of sustenance and cultural importance and so forth. And so today we'll have just a light touch on the question of the hitch. We'll cover it a little bit more next meeting. One thing I'd like to kind of highlight fairly early on is, since we started talking about the SMCs, Sustainable Management Criteria, there isn't a specific Sustainable Management Criteria we set for GDEs. And Mali will explain all about that, but I wanted to kind of talk about that up front. According to Eddie, who's a Sigma expert, we have to identify Sustainable Management Criteria for 6 indicators: water levels, groundwater storage, groundwater quality, subsidence, seawater intrusion, and depletion of interconnected waters. And so we address GDEs through the depletion of interconnected waters. And that's why all of the members of this GDEs committee has been invited to attend the interconnected surface water SMC discussion that will happen after our second meeting. And that kind of, during those two meetings, we'll kind of discuss the information we have, the understanding about connectivity between surface water and groundwater, and how we can monitor and manage for that. And that criteria we set there will help us monitor also for GDEs. So I want to get that kind of upfront. I know I'm jumping way ahead of the discussion, but I kind of provided some context. And so with that, I'm turn it over to Mali. Mali, please share your screen. It's all yours.
Thanks, Ibrahim, for the introduction. Let me share my screen. And please let me know when you all can see my screen.
Affirmative, we can see it.
Okay, great. So as Ibrahim mentioned, and you all know, the Sigma and GSP regulations require the groundwater sustainability plans to have some specific elements be covered under the plan, and the identification of the groundwater dependent ecosystems, or so-called GDEs, is one of those requirements. And of course, along with the impacts of the groundwater management activities on those GDEs. So today I'm going to discuss what processes we follow to identify the GDEs in the Big Valley Basin, and I will start with reviewing some of the legislations. I know that all of you already are completely familiar with these legislations, but please bear with me. Let's spend a couple minutes to review them together, because that will help us to kind of like be reminded what we needed to follow, how we did that, and what we got as a result. So based on Sigma requirements, GDE must be identified under the groundwater sustainability plans. The groundwater sustainability agencies and all the responsible parties for the implementation of the sustainability plans are required, based on California Water Code section, to consider all interests of all beneficial uses and users of groundwater. There is a long list of different interests, and one of those interests is the environmental users of groundwater. Water Code also requires the groundwater sustainability agencies to provide a description of how the sustainability plan is going to meet each objective in a long term in terms of the sustainability of the beneficial uses of groundwater. So under the provision of Sigma, GDEs are considered beneficial users of groundwater, and the dependency of these ecosystems on groundwater, their water needs, is considered as beneficial uses and environmental uses of groundwater. So in addition to those two considerations that I mentioned at the beginning, the sustainability plan must kind of provide a description of potential adverse impacts that groundwater management activities could have on the GDEs. Now, we might answer how the GDEs are identified. What are GDEs? So Sigma defines GDE as the ecological communities or species that depend on groundwater emerging from aquifers or the groundwater occurring near the ground surface. And Groundwater Resources Hub also defined the GDEs as type of plants and animal communities that require groundwater to meet either some or all of their water needs. So based on the Sigma, there are specific processes that we need to follow to do this identification. And here I'm going to explain what that process is. So far, we know that identifying the GDEs is the responsibility of the groundwater sustainability agencies. However, Department of Water Resources has provided a database based on the natural communities commonly associated with groundwater, and I'm going to call that NCAG from now on, to assist the agencies in this process. So that database was based on 48 publicly available state and Fed agency data sets, and it identifies 2 habitat classes. The first habitat class is kind of like associated with the expression of groundwater under unmodified, undisturbed condition, and those are the wetland features. And the second class is the part that is associated with the subsurface presence of groundwater, and those are the vegetation types and the plants communities that we see across any groundwater basin. We need to be careful here that these data sets from DWR is not the final determination of GDEs in any region, but they could be a reasonable and reliable starting point to identify potential GDEs that can be further modified by incorporating the hydrological specification of the area, geological condition, and groundwater levels measurement. And most importantly, by incorporating the data that can be obtained through personal communication from the local library available and anything in that respect. So all that said, the scope of this specific part, the GDE part in the sustainability plan, is to, first of all, delineate the existing recharge area and the potential future recharge and discharge areas, including the wetlands. Second, to identify the groundwater-dependent ecosystem within the basin based on the best available knowledge and information that we could find. And finally, to discuss the potential adverse impacts of groundwater management activities on the GDEs. Before I jump into the GDEs identification section for the Big Valley Basin, I would like to also explain a very important topic about interconnected surface water, which is going to be important in having some of the discussion and building some of the hypotheses about the GDEs identification. So basically, interconnected surface water refers to surface water that is hydraulically connected to the underlying aquifer at any point by a continuous saturated zone. Based on GSP regulations, GDEs are considered as beneficial uses of interconnected surface water. So we needed to figure out whether there is any hydraulic connectivity between the groundwater aquifer along the creeks that we were considering for this study. I focused on Kelsey Creek and Adobe Creek for this specific presentation, and the reason is that most of the GDEs we identified were along these 2 creeks. I know that there will be another meeting talking about the interconnected surface water in detail. I'm not going to go through those level of details, basically kind of like introducing what was important for making our conversation and discussion today about the GDEs. So you see this plot here. The horizontal axis shows the distance, the vertical axis shows the elevation, and my colleague created this plot to kind of like making a comparison between the Kelsey Creek bed elevation, the orange line here, and the groundwater surface elevation under 2 representative conditions. The solid blue line here is representative of the wet condition, and the dashed line shows the dry condition. So if you look at the plot here, you see that for under the wet condition, there will be a hydraulic connectivity like downstream of the State Highway 29 for about 2 miles, I would say. And under the dry condition, that distance is going to be decreasing to about a mile. Yeah, about a mile again, downstream of the State Highway 29. So this seasonal hydraulic connectivity can result in gaining or losing water to the stream, but because we don't have enough evidence, we don't have monitoring, shallow monitoring well to confirm the idea, we cannot say which way it's going. But we know for sure that this area downstream of the Main Street Bridge is most of the time kind of like the creek is losing water to the groundwater, and they are potentially hydraulically disconnected. The exact same argument can be made about the Adobe Creek, but before we move to Adobe Creek plot, these are the pictures that we got through our site visit. Here, I'm showing the upstream of the Main Street Bridge. You can see that there's some evidence of having a highly impervious clay in the bed channel of the Kelsey Creek, which is of course potentially limiting the hydraulic connectivity here. But downstream of the Main Street Bridge, it's showing a highly permeable, like sandy and gravel bed, which is kind of consistent with the conclusion we made based on the previous plot. And like I said, we made the exact same plot for Adobe Creek, and you see here that there is a hydraulic connectivity upstream of the State Highway 29 for about 1.5 miles, but downstream during the wet condition, that connectivity is probably lost, and under the dry condition, it's most probably the creek losing water to the groundwater, and the two sources of water are potentially disconnected. Once again, since we don't have a shallow monitoring well, we cannot for sure confirm if this hypothesis is correct or not. And we need a shallow monitoring well to confirm this idea. Okay, now we know what to do. We have gathered all the useful information and available data. So we are ready to identify the groundwater dependent ecosystems in the Big Valley. And we needed to follow specific processes. So the process we followed is shown here. Basically, we started with the data set that was identified by the NCAG. We incorporated all the data that we gained from our site visit through personal communication, and based on the useful comments that we received on the first draft of the GDE's identification. And at that point, we started asking this question: would the habitat exist if groundwater levels were deeper than the root zone? Obviously, if the answer to this question is yes, it means that the habitat does not depend on the groundwater to survive, so it's not a GDE. But if the answer was no or inconclusive, then we had the second round of the question that should be asked: whether the habitat was able to access shallow groundwater. Is the habitat supplied with supplemental water, or is it adjacent to surface water seepage sources? If the answer to any of these questions based on the habitat type was yes, again, it was not considered as GDEs because it was kind of like meeting its water needs from another source of water. But if the answer was no or inconclusive, we considered that as potential GDEs, and we did some further analysis to confirm our hypothesis there. You might be asking why we incorporated all the inconclusive cases under the potential GDEs, and that's because TNC explicitly advises to consider all the questionable polygons from the NCAG dataset in the GSP plan if there is not sufficient data in time for 2022 plan, and then later based on the monitoring network, we can kind of like reconcile the data gap. But at this stage, we just consider to incorporate all those inconclusive options under the potential GDEs. So following those steps, Here are the map and the list of the GDEs that we identified for the region. First of all, the wetland features that were identified under NCAG database were not considered as GDEs here because they were identified mostly along the tributaries to the Clear Lake. So they are not GDEs. However, we identified two vegetation types, the riparian mixed wood, the green line here, which was along the Kelsey Creek, and the Fremont cottonwood, the purple color here, which was above the Adobe Creek to be potential GDE. Also, from our personal communication and one of the comments that we received on the first draft, we happened to learn that there is an extensive region here along Mago Slough, which has a native oak woodland, and based on our analysis, that area is also potentially a GDE. Also, Peter helped us to learn about hitch in the area. So in some groundwater basin, fish and wildlife that rely on groundwater to survive are considered as GDEs. Basically, the idea in these cases is that higher groundwater level results in higher flows in the creek during the spawning period, and that can be beneficial to the survival of these species. Based on our communication, we learned that hitch in Clear Lake migrates to the tributaries in the spring to spawn, and in that period, there could be a connection between groundwater and surface water, which could make them a candidate for being a GDEs. Most discussion on this topic is going to be deferred to the next meeting, and I'm sure that meeting is going to be much more interesting than this one because Peter has some interesting memories, funny memories about fish that he might want to share with you, and you will enjoy them. So going back to the conversation that we had about the interconnected surface system, again, we feel that there are some evidence showing that at least for a specific part of year, there might be a hydraulic connectivity, but we are not sure how much the contribution from either the groundwater or the surface water to the other source would be. Here are the pictures that we captured from our site visit. You see, these are the GDEs along the Kelsey Creek, and this is the one that we identified above Adobe Creek. So if you remember, I mentioned that one of the intentions in developing this section about the GDEs is to identify the potential impacts of groundwater management activities on the GDEs and the health of the GDEs. So to answer that question, to analyze that part, we looked at the depths to groundwater measurements in the wells around the GDEs that we identified. First of all, we only have 2 GDEs shown on this picture, and the reason is that we only got the data for the GDEs which were originally identified by the NCAG. One above along the Kelsey Creek and the other one above the Adobe Creek. So we didn't have data for the oak woodland that we identified along the Mago Slough. So let's first look at the one along the Kelsey Creek. These graphs here all show the date in the horizontal axis and depths to groundwater in feet in the vertical axis. You can see that for the wells around this one on top, the spring groundwater depths to groundwater measurements is fluctuating between 10 almost to 20 feet below groundwater surface. But the summer depths to groundwater is fluctuating between 25 and 50 almost below groundwater surface, and the reason of the higher fluctuations during summer could be due to increase in the extraction because of the dry condition.
Molly, Bethany has her hand up. Bethany, did you have a question or a comment?
Yeah, I just wanted to, it sounded like on the last slide that the tributaries were included as a GDE. And I just wanted to confirm that, and that, and then I would like more of an explanation about why the wetland features identified along most of the tributaries were not included as GDEs.
So based on the definitions, whenever the wetlands are considered to receive their share of water based on the regulations, or basically they are regulated, they are not considered as GDEs. And since most of these wetlands were along the Clear Lake tributaries and they were kind of like considered as regulated, I believe we removed them from the GDE's consideration. And Ibrahim can correct me if I'm wrong.
The only stream that's regulated, as far as I know, is Adobe. In terms of regulated, meaning that it has dams on it.
Yeah, I think that the intent is, the question we're asking is, are these wetlands rely on surface water, or they rely on groundwater? And so that's the key definition for the GDE. If we feel that they at least receive partial of their water on groundwater, then they become GDEs. The thing that's kind of, you look here, all of them are kind of concentrated along the creek based on this database. And when we walked along the creek, we actually didn't along the creeks. I mean, again, most of the habitat along the creek, and the question is, and again, it's a question of judgment. We can go either way. If people feel strongly about those, that's definitely, we can then add them back. But just based on the evidence, they don't have a presence away from the creek. And if they have any presence away from the creek, then you can say, yep, they could be relying on other groundwater. But then you can see here, all of them are concentrated just along the creek, which kind of beg the question is, are they only, and are they just surface water features? And I'm looking for, maybe you know the area better than us, Bethany. I'm kind of looking for your feedback.
Well, I mean, I think what I also heard is we don't know the degree of connection of these creeks to the groundwater, and that there is obviously a connection between surface water and groundwater. So I don't feel great about excluding the tributaries from being GDEs, especially when we're talking about the hitch, who have to migrate upstream and they need water to do so. So that's my take on that. And I don't think we should strike them out until we get enough information to actually know the answer to that question.
Okay.
Just like the Nature Conservancy says, you know, if you don't know, then include it and figure it out later.
Okay, that's a fair point. Okay.
Yeah, thank you, Bethany. And everyone else, I'm not seeing who is raising his hand, so please feel free to chime in whenever you feel that you have something to add or you have a question to ask. So, okay, let's go back here to the depths to groundwater measurements conversation that we had. If we look at the GDEs above Adobe Creek here that I'm pointing to, we had only one well, which was closest to the GDEs, and it was about half a mile on the east of the GDEs. You can see here that the spring groundwater to depth to groundwater is about 90 feet below groundwater surface, and the summer goes as far as 120 to 150 feet below groundwater surface. At the same time, we are not sure if this well can be representative of the real condition that we are seeing at the GDEs above the Adobe Creek due to the long distance that this specific well has compared to the location of these GDEs. And we know that there's a huge data gap here. We are not sure about the aquifer in most of these wells across these GDEs. So to complete our discussion about the impact of the management activities on the GDEs, one other reasonable approach was to look at the health of the GDEs. And we did that using two approaches. One was the examination of the extent and spread of the GDEs, and the other one was the assessment of the relative vegetation health. And we did that also using two indices. The first indices, the normalized derived vegetation index, or NDVI, was kind of like representative of the greenness of the vegetation. And the second one was the NDMI, the normalized derived moisture index, which, as you can see, is a representative of the moisture content of the GDEs. Here on this map, you see the NDVI trend for the two GDEs, the one along the Kelsey Creek and this one above Adobe Creek. So the green color shows moderate increase, yellow color shows little to no change, and the orange color here shows the moderate decrease. As you can see, we can say that from 1985 to 2018, there is almost not a concerning change in terms of the health of the GDEs in neither of these two identified GDEs. And once again, since we didn't have any data for this one, this GDE along Slough, we were not able to identify these indices for this specific one. And this map is only showing the NDVI trend for these two GDEs. If we want to look at each of them specifically, here are the graphs for the GDEs along Kelsey Creek. This graph is showing the NDVI, and the bottom one is showing the NDMI. As you can see, the recent trend has been above the historical average for both health indices, and we were able to find a strong correlation between the two health indices, which is kind of like supporting the idea that in terms of health, the GDEs is in a good condition. However, we were not able to identify a strong correlation between these health indices and depth to groundwater measurements. But at the same time, since we had the conversation about the interconnected surface water, there we decided that if and when we identify any hydraulic connectivity with the groundwater, then although the evidence is showing that that specific habitat or GDEs is relying on surface water, we can argue that it is relying on groundwater as well to meet part of its water need. So for the GDEs along the Kelsey Creek, we can argue that the source of water is both from groundwater and Kelsey Creek as well. The exact same argument can be made for the GDEs above Adobe Reservoir. Here again, you see that the recent trends are above the historical average for both health indices, and there's a strong correlation between the two health indices, as you can see in this plot here. And the source of water here, although we have Adobe Reservoir next to the identified GDEs, but based on that interconnected surface water conversation, we can argue that these GDEs are also relying on groundwater, at least for part of year, to meet part of their water needs. After we did those identification, we needed to see if our process was compatible with the best management practices that was provided by TNC. And those practices are listed here. So the first one in the list was to establish a connection to groundwater, and this could be done based on their recommendation through using the depths to groundwater measurement and the routing zones, and this is exactly what we did. So we could check this item in the list. The second one was to use a long-term depths to groundwater data and at least 10 years. As I mentioned, the data we used was from 1985 through 2018, which is again fine here in this list. The third item was to consider that ecosystems often rely on both groundwater and surface water, and we were able to identify that to confirm that we are considering this fact in the region. And fourth item was to select representative groundwater wells within 3 miles of the GDEs, and most of all of the wells that we used to do the analysis around each of the GDEs were at a much closer distance to the GDEs, and using the contouring groundwater elevations, which has been done in our plan, and using the best available science through using the NCAG dataset or having communication with the locals, having site visits, which we all followed all these steps. In terms of compliance with the fish and wildlife requirements, there are 3 specific conditions that we need to meet. One is the scientific condition, the second one is the management condition, and the third one is regulatory and policy condition. So for the scientific conditions, the groundwater sustainability plan should answer some key questions about GDEs in terms of the existence, the determination of the adverse impacts that could be attributed to the groundwater management, and the identification of appropriate management response action. In terms of the management condition, again, as I mentioned at the beginning, kind of like identifying the potential adverse impact that this specific implementation could have on the fish and wildlife, and the impacts of the management actions, the timeline should be explained in detail. And finally, in terms of the policy and legal and regulatory requirements, the ones that I have highlighted in yellow should be considered when we are preparing this plan. So now that you have listened to all the steps that we followed, the GDEs that we identified based on the conversations that we have had so far, the comments we received, and the site visits we had, we want to hear from you. What do you think about this presentation, about the entire draft and plan that we have provided so far? Do you think the criteria that we used to identify the GDEs were appropriate? And do you think there is any data source we have missed in between that could be useful in the identification? And whether or not you think that there is any other potential GDEs that we have missed in the list? And we would like to hear that from you.
Thanks, Mally.
Yep.
Let's see if we have volunteers. Maybe you can hear from Bethany, Brenna, Scott. Do you have any ideas or thoughts?
Yeah, Abraham, I think it may have been mentioned once before. I'm just kind of curious, why have we eliminated Highland Springs?
Highland Spring.
It was right next to the Adobe Creek Reservoir, and we're identifying potential ones there. It just seems like it's very small. We've only identified those 2, and possibly a third one, perhaps.
So you mean there is a habitat along Highland Spring?
Potentially, I guess. I don't know. It seems odd that we're identifying potential ones on Adobe Reservoir, but just to the west of that is Highland Springs, but we're not identifying, it's outside of the actual study area.
Mally, can you go back to the presentation and show the slides? Let's have the from the TNC or TWR dataset?
Sure.
Yeah, I think we did not eliminate anything. That's basically the data set we started with. So this is basically a statewide database where the DWR, TNC, and CDFW kind of compiled aerial imagery on habitat and database on species, and they identified 2 locations here in the one above Adobe Creek and the one along Kelsey Creek as potential GDEs. And as well as also these small riparian, probably they call them wetlands, but I'm calling riparian habitat along the creeks as potential GDEs. There was nothing mentioned or listed along Highland Spring, but that doesn't mean it is not GDE. It just means it was not in this database. As I said, also we got information that we should include these habitat in the pink area around Megos Creek, and so maybe that's something I think Scott, we could take another look at if there is any specific habitat along. And maybe if you zoom in here, is Highland Spring outside the study area?
Yeah, it's right outside of the area, so it's just simply been clipped out.
Yeah.
Of that.
Yeah. All right. Thank you. Let's make an easier explanation. It was clipped out, Scott. So.
Yeah.
It's just curious because it certainly feeds creeks that run through Big Valley.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is. It's true. It's definitely, and it's going to be a potential mechanism of supplying groundwater, replenishing groundwater through Adobe Creek. So it's kind of interesting that Highland Springs is not part of our study area, the reservoir itself.
So for Bethany, what's I'm surprised by kind of how healthy the GDEs in this area looks, or this habitat looks in pretty good shape.
Well, yeah, maybe it does. I am coming at it from the perspective of the hitch, and so my comment on this is to not exclude the tributary wetlands and channels from being GDEs, because there are animals that depend on those ecosystems, which are, at least partially dependent on groundwater. So, I mean, we've already said all that. So that's my comment here is I wouldn't want to see just these 3 patches be the only GDEs in the area.
Okay, thank you. So, Christy, we have a very quiet group.
You do have a very quiet group.
Which
I don't
good.
know if it's helpful at all in preparation for your meeting on September 2nd to ask if there's any information that people are curious about, anything that they think that might be brought to bear, or anything that they might want to hear about at that particular meeting.
Yeah. Especially regarding to the hitch and its relationship with the groundwater.
So quiet.
Yep.
And and go ahead, Scott.
Just you had identified, I think it was the cottonwood in that one little stretch there on, I think, Kelsey Creek. And there's a bunch of other cottonwoods farther down towards the lake as well, but is it just they're separated too far? I don't know. I mean, they've got to be using the groundwater, right, to grow and live.
Yeah, I think if we followed Bethany's suggestion about including most of the habitat along the creeks, that probably will take care of those cottonwoods or all those other habitat that just runs along the creeks all the way down to the lake.
So Ibrahim, this is Eddie, the non-biologist in the group. You know, one of the things we need to think about as we kind of move through this process is, you know, we've kind of followed sort of the TNC recommendations, and then we've got these areas that, you know, could potentially be GDEs. And, you know, my experience is that's the way TNC wants to kind of, you know, help to define those areas. If we don't have the data, then you can label them as potential. And then we just have to look at ways to fill the data gaps to sort of better understand that. And, you know, there's some, you know, reasons or there's some applications that we can utilize and or, you know, would involve installing shallow monitoring wells, you know, post GSP submittal. And so I think, you know, we probably need to think about, you know, how they're labeled, and then, you know, keeping them sort of framed as sort of potential through this process, you know, so.
Yeah, and identify critical areas that we need to monitor and priority areas we need to monitor and improve. And along the same line too, discussion is about impacts to GDEs from groundwater management. I mean, leaving the hitch aside, looking at those habitat and just looking at the condition we've seen just in the aerial imagery. There was a range of groundwater conditions from dry to wet over many years. The one thing that's kind of good in this basin, or kind of in make the analysis basin easier, is there hasn't been big changes in groundwater use or level of extraction. There have been changes in cropping pattern and so forth, but at a fairly relatively small rate of increase. But we've seen a lot of changes in groundwater elevation in response to dry and wet cycles over the last 20-25 years. And within that range, the habitat itself have fared fairly okay. And so that will give us kind of a range when we look at setting up the minimum threshold, at least for this terrestrial habitat that looks decent. For the hitch, that was a separate discussion and question about what we can do there.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think, yeah, go ahead, Bethany. Sorry.
I was just going to say, like, perhaps some of the ecosystems are doing well, but I can tell you that the hitch are not doing well. So that is part of the ecosystem. They are part of the ecosystem.
Yeah. And I think, you know, for the GSP, and again, we'll maybe going to talk about this, you know, at the next meeting, is specifically to this SMC, or the sort of, you know, groundwater or surface water depletion piece. We're probably going to end up using water levels initially as a proxy for this SMC, and then we're going to have to spell out the details of the additional work that's going to be required to install. I mean, ideally what we want is a stream gauge right next to a monitoring well, right? So those are the data gaps that are going to be required to really sort of further characterize that system. So I think,
and ideally we also need multiple surface water gauges, just to kind of a different section of the creek to understand kind of changes in the gaining and loss. I mean, for me, looking from the outside in this area, and Bethany, sorry, I'm putting you on the spot, but one of the, I mean, I understand the hitch is complicated, similar to, I'm more familiar with the salmon and some issues on the major tributaries here in the Central Valley. But the hitch probably a similar story. It's fairly complicated. There's also other issues, but I'm interested to understand or kind of know just from the local perspective, when did the Kelsey Creek and Adobe Creek started to go dry? Do they always go dry? How far that started? That like 30 years ago, 50? Would they run year round in the past, and something changed to make them go dry, or yeah? I'm just kind of want to get a perspective on that.
Well, this is Brenna. I can speak to, you know, I've lived on Kelsey Creek for the last 30 years. And, you know, sorry, my phone's ringing. Right now, we're in a pretty unprecedented drought. And so both creeks are dry. In previous years that have been dry, the creeks have gotten very low. I wouldn't say that there's a general trend that they're dry where they didn't used to be dry. I think in the 70s, where we also had that unprecedented drought. You know, Peter might be able to speak to that, but at least from my perspective, this is just qualitative from living on the creek. I haven't seen a general trend. I know that within Big Valley, agricultural water use just, again, qualitatively has gone down with, you know, pears coming out and less water intensive crops going in as the long-term trend. I guess one question I had is on that data collection. What is the timeline on that? Are we going to have kind of some short-term data collection to be able to establish surface to groundwater interactions in some of these areas like the tributaries before they get established as GDEs? Because it seems like there's two approaches. One is to just include them before we have that data. The other is to wait until we have the data. And that probably depends on how quickly we can get that data collected and what the timeline is on that.
This is Eddie, the non-biologist. But what I've heard from TNC, who really are going to be, I think, the entity that's sort of comes in and really focuses their attention on this piece, is if we don't have the data to suggest it is not a GDE, label it as a potential GDE, and then put a plan in place to sort of further, you know, characterize that potential GDE. So that's sort of, I think, one question you had. And then the other one would be, we'd have to lay out a plan on how we would look to fill the data gaps. And you know, that those plans or those exercises cost money. And so I think the only way that would fund that would be through some of the post or the GSP implementation dollars that are going to be coming out very soon. So we could tap into grants to, you know, look at, you know, implementing a stronger monitoring plan sort of focused on
yeah.
this.
And the data collection part of it is not something you do in a month or even in a year. It's multi-year. You need to collect data for a very long time to look at trends and connectivity and during different cycles of drought and wet years and so forth, to be able to come out to make sure any meaningful. So I don't think we'll be able to move from potential GDE to GDEs or not GDEs until probably the 5-year update of the GSP.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
Cool. Yeah. So since you were asking me, yeah, I'm not somebody that can give a real good local perspective. I don't live in the area. I've been working on this area for a few years now, and Sarah, I've learned a lot from Sarah with regard to the history. I mean, something has shifted for the habitat for the hitch, you know, and going dry in the summer is not really an issue for them. It's when the stream kind of goes dry during the time of year when they're up there spawning, and the the baby fish are trying to get back down. And so that's when the big kills are happening. And so maybe these creeks always went dry in the summer, but something, there's been a whole lot of changes in the watershed that have culminated to cause issues for them. One of them being groundwater depletion, from my understanding, during the time of year when it matters.
Okay.
And that may have to do with like rainfall changes as well. So, I think
so
the point is that we don't really have enough information to answer the question at this point.
Okay. No, that's it. That's really helpful. So it's not a summer issue. It's mostly a spring and late spring question when there is enough water to allow them to kind of migrate down. Yeah.
I guess the question that I'm trying to answer by being part of all this process is what mechanisms are available through this GSP process to try to help bring back some of what was lost in terms of providing a sustainable situation for the hitch.
Okay, that would be a very good discussion. I think we're setting the stage for a really good discussion for our next meeting on the GD on the hitch. We have a presentation by Peter and Sarah will be there, so we'll have a really good discussion about that. And then after that, I think looking forward, we will have a discussion. We'll shift a little bit to talk more about the surface water and groundwater connectivity specifically, and what do we know and what we don't know, the data gaps, what SMCs we can set up in terms of minimum threshold and so forth. And then we'll come back and close the discussion for this GDE via having a discussion about management actions. Are there any specific management action we can take to propose to, one, further understand, and two, better manage the potential GDEs we talked about. So that could include various different studies, data collection effort, and so forth that we could discuss. Eddie, anything else, or can we end the meeting early, give everyone 30 minutes or 25-minute back?
No, this is very helpful. And I think this is, again, sort of one of the benefits of meeting with this smaller group is to kind of, hear the concerns. I know Bethany, we've talked a little bit during previous meetings about sort of looking at ways to, enhance stream flows and those kind of things. And those are sort of the projects and or management actions that Ibrahim was talking about. We have to come up with ways. I mean, it's the easy part is characterizing the system. The hard part is sort of developing sort of projects and or management actions to, enhance recharge. I mean, there's really only two ways to do it. One is you bring more water in, and the other option is, you stop pumping in certain areas. So you have to kind of balance that out a little bit. So if you can give that some more thought and ideas. I mean, again, at this point, everything is on the table, but recognizing, all stakeholders, how do we find that balance? And it's not easy. So.
Yeah, I certainly understand that. And yeah, this is the first GSP I've been a part of. So I'm just still trying to figure out what is this thing, and, what can it do and what can't it do?
Sure.
Sort of question. So,
and we've got this model.
I wonder
sorry, go ahead.
I guess I wonder from your perspective about the question brought up earlier regarding Highland Springs Reservoir not being part of the study area, but potentially being a mechanism by which we, bring more water into the system. And your thoughts on including that, or is it even an issue that it's not technically part of the study area?
Yeah, so I mean, as far as the GSP itself, that's one item. But one thing, remember, for our model that we've developed, the water resource model that we have, we include the entire watershed. So there's some scenarios that we can start to look at, where we can looking at ways to enhance recharge and/or adjust pumping, just to see what the impact might be on, as an example, on stream leakage or something like that. So there's some analysis that we can do with the model that can sort of address, including that, the reservoir. So, or at least upgrading of the reservoir. So, does that make sense?
Yeah. Yep.
Okay. So that's all I have, Ibrahim. So yeah, no, I think this is very helpful, and we'll continue the conversation, and just so you don't feel like you're alone, this is always probably the most difficult SMC to address, for several reasons, but primarily because we don't always have the best data sets to go with. We don't have the groundwater levels where we need them in certain areas, and stream gauges and those kind of things. So you all are not alone in working through this particular SMC. So
Yeah.
This is John. I just thought I'd share a few ideas. Well, one is the GDEs are really, it's a broad category, a lot of different species, and perhaps there would be a way to prioritize, or what's the driver or the sensitive species that we really are most concerned with, and that could be the hitch. So that's one idea, and another idea is just that if you have surface water and there's a ecological community living by that surface water, it doesn't mean that it is or isn't a GDE. Really, you have to take it to the next step, which is there groundwater coming into that surface water? So if the answer is yes, then it is. If the answer is no, then it's not. So you can have surface water and groundwater in the same place, and if groundwater is coming in, then it's a GDE. If groundwater is not, then it's just surface water. So it's not groundwater dependent.
That's helpful. Thank you.
Thanks, John. I think that's kind of sums it well, and that's kind of where we're at. We have all the we try to do the best with all the limited data we have, and kind of that's where we're at right now. So I think we're we're looking for any additional data sets that you might be aware of, or any other areas that might be GDEs that we would like to include, and that's something we could report back on the GSPAC meeting next week. And then just wanted to say thank you for everyone for making the time today, and we'll see you on September 2nd.
Thank you. Thanks for the
Thank you.
presentation.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.